The How Is This Movie podcast is supported by listeners like you. Go to www.patreon.com/howisthismovie. There you can pledge as little as $1 a month and help us maintain our goal of keeping this show independent and free of advertising. Hello everyone and welcome to How Is This Movie. My name is Dana Buckler and thank you for taking just a little time out of your day to listen. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @HowIsThisMovie. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/howisthismovie. You can always email me with questions or comments, hitmpodcast@gmail.com. And if you're enjoying the show, please take a moment and leave us a review on whatever platform you use to listen. In this episode, I am joined by Jim Hemphill. Longtime listeners of the show will recall that Jim has joined me on 2 other occasions. The first time was to discuss his wonderful movie, Trouble with the Truth. Jim's second appearance on the show was in part 3 of my look at Paul Thomas Anderson's Boogie Nights. Along with being a very accomplished filmmaker, Jim also brings an expert knowledge of all things film and offers insights into movies that will make you look at some of your favorite films in a completely new light. For Jim's third appearance on How Is This Movie, he was gracious enough to spend a little over an hour with me to break down the filmography of Wes Craven, the man behind such classics as Last House on the Left, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream, and many more fantastic films. Sadly, the world lost Craven back in August of 2015, and I remember the moment I heard the news. I immediately reached out to Jim for his thoughts. In 2014, Jim interviewed Wes during the 30th anniversary celebration of Nightmare on Elm Street, and I think you will agree that after listening to this episode, that there was no one better than Jim Hemphill to join me. A quick side note. A few times during the interview, the Skype connection got a little shaky, but that shouldn't take away from your overall enjoyment of this episode. Thank you, and now, let's talk to Jim. Jim Hemphill, welcome back to How Is This Movie? You are the first 3-time guest of How Is This Movie, so that's awesome. How are you doing today?
All right. I'm great, thanks.
Awesome. Well, back in August 30th of 2015, we lost one of the great filmmakers of any generation. I had reached out to you back then and said that, I want to do a retrospective on Wes Craven's career. It's been about 6 months since he passed away. Before we get into his life and career, what kind of impact did Wes Craven have on you as a filmmaker?
Well, it's pretty big because Craven, for me, just on a personal level, is one of those directors who he was one of the first directors I was aware of as a director. As a kid, even before I really even understood what directors did, I knew who Wes Craven was because of Nightmare on Elm Street and The Hills Have Eyes and Last House on the Left. I was a big horror fan. And and probably one of the first books I ever read of kind of, I guess you would, call it critical writing, was this book Stephen King wrote called Dance Macabre that was his volume on the horror genre. And he actually wasn't a big Wes Craven fan, at least not at the time. He kind of dismissed him in the book. But in the book, he mentions Wes Craven, and I realized how many movies Craven had done that I had liked, and that to me, this was somebody where even if I didn't exactly understand what a director did, I knew that all the movies that said directed by Wes Craven had something in common that I responded to. So the interesting thing about Craven is he's kind of one of those directors like Walter Hill or John Carpenter or Clint Eastwood, who I was aware of as a little kid, a movie fan, but then continued to be aware of as I grew as both a person and a filmmaker, as I realized that I wanted to make my own movies. And his films started to mean something a little bit different to me as I got older and got interested in making my own films. And then even when I did start making my own films. Because the thing that's interesting about Craven is that his movies really do operate on so many levels. I mean, he's kind of an interesting, contradictory filmmaker in some ways, in that he's this very scholarly intellectual and this very mild-mannered guy who made some of the most savage movies ever. And I think that's where a lot of their strength comes from. I think a lot of people make movies that are very visceral or confrontational that don't necessarily have Craven's brain behind them. And there are a lot of people who have Craven's brains who are a little bit restrained when it comes to actually going for the throat. And Craven kind of did both, which is what I think makes a movie like Last House on the Left so powerful, is that combination. And I've always been, just as a movie goer, I'm a big fan of a wide spectrum of movies. And in a way, my favorite movies are the ones that kind of combine, what I would say they combine the art house and the grindhouse. And Wes Craven is kind of one of those people. And that had a big impact on me. And especially on my first movie, I made the slow budget horror film called Bad Reputation. And Craven was by far and away the filmmaker who was the most on my mind while I was making that, because the whole idea was to sort of when in doubt, what would Wes Craven do? Especially what would the Wes Craven of the 70s do?
Sure.
I sort of was trying to make something that, not that I came close to succeeding, but in my mind, the goal was to combine that kind of intelligence and raw impact and doing it on a low budget like he did his earlier films and all that. So it had a direct influence on me in that way. And then his movies just had sort of a general influence in terms of the kind of sensibility and the way he saw the world. I mean, I think his movies were very anti-establishment, and very confrontational in a great way. I mean, he was not a guy, and again, different movies do different things, and he had a diverse career, but in general, for a guy who ended up being so popular, he wasn't really interested in comforting you the way that a lot of filmmakers are. And that always, stuck with me, that both as a viewer and as a filmmaker, that sometimes it's okay to make movies that are a little bit more difficult, and that those can sometimes over the long run be more rewarding than the ones that are more superficially satisfying in the moment.
You had mentioned that Craven was an incredibly smart guy. He had a master's degree in philosophy, and he taught English before he got into filmmaking. Now, before he made the movie Last House on the Left, he entered the filmmaking world in a much different avenue. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the landscape of the very early 1970s and sort of the first foray into filmmaking that Craven got into. By that, I'm talking about the sort of the off-the-record movies that he made, the ones that are hard to find, but you can locate them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not as familiar. It's a sort of murky area, as some people know, and Craven talks a little bit about it there's a great documentary called Inside Deep Throat that's about the making of the movie Deep Throat, but it also gets into the larger picture of porno movies in the 70s. And at that time, porno was kind of an entry-level position for people who wanted to actually make, quote unquote, real movies. Back then they didn't have high def or digital video or the internet or any of these other ways where you could make movies. So if you were a young filmmaker who didn't have a lot of money, in some ways your access to the tools was the adult film industry. And I'm not, greatly schooled in the details of Craven's forays into that, although I have seen one of his movies. I have a bootleg DVD of a movie called Angela the Fireworks Woman that he directed under a pseudonym. That's a porno movie. And it's pretty fascinating because it really does feel like a Wes Craven movie. I mean, it kind of proves that certain directors, their voice is so strong that no matter what, it's going to come through. And that movie is definitely like that. I mean, it's kind of it's a porno movie that has a very European art house kind of sensibility to it. And that's something, he was clearly a guy who was influenced heavily by Ingmar Bergman. I mean, a lot of people know that Last House on the Left was a loose remake of Virgin Spring, and A Nightmare on Elm Street, I think, goes a lot to certain European filmmakers like Buñuel, and other surrealist directors. And you can kind of see that even in his porno movie, it's kind of an interesting thing. What do you get when you have a porno movie directed by a philosophy professor who's into Bergman and Buñuel, and you get Angela the Fireworks Woman? But I don't know that he was always a little bit cagey about what movies he actually did and what he worked on. And I'm not as schooled in that part of his career as I am from the quote unquote, legitimate period that started with Last House on the Left.
Let's talk about Last House on the Left just for a moment here. It came out in 1972. I've seen the movie, I think, in its entirety 3 times, and I'm not even sure what cuts of the film that I've seen. Can we talk just a little bit about the impact that movie had and the controversy surrounding that film?
Well, the interesting thing about the different cuts is, I met Craven a few times, and, I wouldn't presume to say that we were friends, but we were friendly, and I talked with him a little bit about Last House on the Left, and the story he told me was that they submitted the movie to the ratings board several times and just kept getting hammered. The ratings board, they just kept giving it an X rating, and so finally they took out a bunch of stuff, everything that could possibly have been considered offensive, gave it to the ratings board, got an R rating, and Craven and his producer Sean Cunningham figured, well, none of these 7 or 8 people who are on the MPAA ratings board are ever going to watch this movie again. So they put all the footage back in, put it out in the theaters with the R rating on the poster, but it was actually the original X-rated cut. And that is, I believe, what's out now on the thing that's out on Blu-ray and DVD is actually Craven's cut, and to a certain degree, the idea that there were different cuts of it floating around was a little more of a rumor than a fact, because for the most part it was his original cut. However, there was a point, I believe, in the 80s where they got found out, and they did have to put out VHS copies in the 80s that were pretty severely truncated. But the movie is absolutely amazing in its ferocity, and I've seen it many, many times, and I saw it on the big screen a few years ago at a horror marathon. It's like an all-night horror-thon at a theater in Hollywood called the Arrow, and they showed it at about 3 a.m. It was a 35 millimeter print of Last House on the Left, in the middle of the night. And if anything, I feel like that movie has more of a sort of an impact today than it might have when it came out in 1972, because at the time it came out in 72, I feel like it was a little bit more, it shocked people, but there was it was almost a little more in tune with its time. And the interesting thing about Craven in general, one of the interesting things about him is he's the only horror director I know of who 3 decades in a row made a horror movie that was both iconic and sort of emblematic of its period. Last House on the Left in the 70s, Elm Street in the 80s, and Scream in the 90s. And Last House on the Left in the 70s, I feel like, is very much a film, it's what horror movies kind of were in that period, and what American movies in general were, where they were much more nihilistic and kind of responding to the sort of pessimism of the time, responding to Vietnam, and, I guess Watergate came after Last House on the Left, but it was just part of that kind of general sense of malaise in the air and cynicism and anger and wanting to blow everything up. And Last House on the Left, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Night of the Living Dead and several other seminal horror movies that came out around that time, they are really movies born of a culture that was just tearing itself apart. And I feel like that makes them, in some ways, they've aged so well and are so powerful. And, watching Last House on the Left with an audience a couple of years ago, I really felt like people, you could sense from people in the audience watching that movie that they were really scared, not just by the movie, but by the guy making it. Like, you watch Last House on the Left and you realize this is a filmmaker who can damage you. He can psychically cause you harm. And I mean that as a compliment. I think that's actually a very, I think it's harder to do that in horror movies than people think.
It's not my intention to jump all over the time period we're talking about, but I feel remiss if we don't comment on the 2009 remake of Last House on the Left, which, if I'm not mistaken, Craven gave a half-hearted endorsement to, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that remake was. I did see it in the theater, and it was a forgettable film, in my opinion.
Well, it certainly doesn't resonate the way the original does, and I think it's it's funny because in a superficial sense, you could probably make the argument that the remake is a better made film than the original. It's well acted, it's well photographed, it's very polished. I mean, I thought, I guess, forgettable is both harsh and a good word for it, because while I was watching it in the theater, I thought it was perfectly. And if you remove the idea of the first one from it, if you just take it for what it is, it's a pretty effective thriller. And like I say, I thought the performances were great, but it doesn't have, it's funny. I always think about Gus Van Sant's Psycho remake, which is a really fascinating experiment because, in that case, you've got a remake that's literally shot by shot a remake of the original. The only thing that's different is that it's in color. And yet it doesn't feel anything like the original. And it just proves that vision is the one thing you can't really steal. I mean, you can steal ideas and you can steal even individual shots and things like that. But there's just something that seeps into the celluloid when a movie is being made that is either going to make it work or not. And somehow, I think the new Last House on the Left, it just doesn't feel made by, I'm sure that everyone making it was, out to make a good movie. But it doesn't feel like a movie that's made by people who were driven to make that movie. And Last House on the Left, the original, I know that, in some ways it was purely opportunistic on Craven's part. I mean, he didn't set out wanting to necessarily be a horror director. He just wanted to make movies, and that opportunity arose where they said, well, if you write a scary movie, we'll make it. But I still think that just knowing what I know about him and knowing what I know about the times, I do feel like his anger and his sort of anti-establishment point of view drove the original, and in a way that the new one is, it's like a nice cover version or something, but it doesn't really have a reason for existing.
And I want to clarify that when I say forgettable, what I really mean that I believe that by 2009, when that film came out, I was, I guess you could say, beyond desensitized to violence on screen. I don't think it had the impact that I thought it would have. I thought, well, here we go. We're going to get a remake of one of the, let's be honest, one of the toughest movies to watch. And in the early 70s, it must have just been incredible to watch this. I kind of expected them to really, really ramp it up a little bit. I will say that I thought the rape scene in the remake was actually unnecessary, and I actually thought that took away from the actual film. Like, I just left the theater like, yeah, okay, well, it didn't impact me the way I thought it was going to impact me.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's funny because, I think about this all the time, when I see a movie like that, I do wonder, okay, is that movie not really that strong, or is it me? Have I changed? Have I become, as you say, so desensitized, that these things don't have the effect on me anymore? But then every once in a while, I'll watch something where I realize that's not the case. There's this is getting a little bit off topic, but there's a great found footage movie called Megan is Missing that I discovered on Netflix. And it really, really shook me in a way that the original Last House on the Left did. And this is a movie that's only a few years old now, directed by Michael Goy, who's a cinematographer on American Horror Story. And he made this $20,000 found footage movie about the abduction of a couple of teenage girls. And it is just absolutely chilling. And I watched it at 7 a.m. with my coffee for some reason. And it shook me so much. I immediately left the house and went to see the first show of Smurfs 2 because I had to see something that was exactly the opposite, that was just going to completely wipe it out of my brain before I felt like I was caused permanent damage. But anyway, but it's an interesting question that I always think about, which is what makes a movie truly disturbing? Because I don't think it's just about the graphic quality of it, because as you say, movies now, in a way, they do ramp it up more than in Craven's day. And even the two versions of I Spit on Your Grave is another kind of notoriously shocking movie from the 70s. And the remake of that, in certain ways, is more graphic, but it's still not as just completely rough to sit through as the original one is. And I still haven't quite been able to put my finger on it, on what it is that makes something have that impact and what doesn't. It's kind of hard to define.
So let's go up to 1977 with the release of The Hills Have Eyes. What was the overarching message of that film in your opinion?
Well, I think in a way it was sort of further developing an idea that's there in Last House on the Left, which is this, and again, this thing with Craven about, I guess his first few movies are really these kind of, I don't know if I call them attacks on American complacency or suburban complacency, as much as I'd say they're kind of, revealing it to be a lie. Like, basically, they're these films about the savagery that lurks within the placid surfaces. And so, in Last House on the Left, you've got a group of horribly violent rapists and thugs who, kill a couple of girls, and then one of the girls' parents takes revenge and proves themselves, they prove themselves to have the same kind of reservoirs of violence and anger that the thugs do. And Hills Have Eyes is kind of a similar thing. And Craven he throughout his career, again, he was this kind of old school lefty. And although his movies certainly never kind of simplistic political diatribes or anything like that, I do think there are these sort of like little satiric commentaries throughout them on the capitalist system and things like that. And I think he got to a point in his career with some of his movies where the cannibalism thing was sort of like a metaphor for, what do you get when you take capitalism to its most extreme? It's literally people feeding on each other. Cause there's this whole sort of storyline in Hills Have Eyes, which now I actually haven't watched that one in a long time. So my memory is a little hazy, but if I remember correctly, it has something to do, the way the people became mutants, and it has something to do with some sort of corporate malfeasance or something. And so I think, Hills Have Eyes, again, I think it was sort of like a development of those ideas in Last House on the Left. And Hills Have Eyes is a little bit, it's still gritty, but it's a little bit more polished, which I think has both, there are ways that's good and there are ways that's bad when it comes to horror. I mean, horror is a funny genre because I think it's one of the few genres that in some ways, when it's not as well made, that can serve it better.
Let's talk about made-for-TV movies. He made one in 1978, Stranger in Our House. Did you see that?
I have, but it's been so many years. The TV movies, I'm a little bit more ignorant about those.
Well, I bring that up because you had mentioned that he didn't get into this game to be a horror director.
Right.
And that really brings me to, we talk about Stranger in Our House, which was a made-for-TV movie, which obviously there were some major restraints that would have been placed on him for making a film, especially back in 1978 when that film came out. In 81, he came out with Deadly Blessing. But what I want to talk about is 1982's Swamp Thing. Mm-hmm. Because here, to me, is a clear departure from the horror genre, and maybe an attempt to sort of broaden his appeal and where he's going with his filmmaking career. What are your thoughts on Swamp Thing?
It's funny because as a kid, Swamp Thing was my favorite. I mean, it was kind of the one that, again, maybe made me even particularly aware of him, and I'm still a pretty big fan of it. With the disclaimer that I don't know, I'm not a big comic book guy, so I don't really know anything about how faithful or unfaithful it was to the source material. And I know some people who are friends of mine who are into comics don't really care for that movie. Swamp Thing, I think, is kind of an interesting example of him. I don't feel, watching it now, I really enjoy that movie, but I don't feel his personality in it the way I feel it in the earlier movies you talked about, or Nightmare on Elm Street, or even, or even Deadly Friend, which came a few years later. I mean, Swamp Thing to me does feel kind of like a guy trying to show that he can be a director for hire, and I think it's a really good example of that. But it doesn't really feel thematically or conceptually linked to his other movies to me, and I could be wrong about that, but it feels a little bit more detached.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but that movie wasn't a box office success, correct? Like, it didn't do very well in its theatrical run, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I don't think so. Although, ironically, the way things work, I think it ended up becoming getting enough of a cult following on cable and video that then they actually did a sequel to it that Craven had nothing to do with. But yeah, I don't think that when it came out, it was very successful. In fact, I mean, that's kind of one of the crazy things about Craven is for somebody who's as popular as he was, it took him a very long time to become a sort of financially successful director. When he did Nightmare on Elm Street, he was borrowing money from Sean Cunningham to pay his mortgage and to pay his taxes and things like that. I mean, he wasn't actually doing all that well. And in fact, he kind of complains that he made the worst deal in the world for the first Nightmare on Elm Street because he was in such financial dire straits, and kind of gave away all the sequel and merchandising rights and all that kind of stuff to New Line, and they made, of course, built an entire studio on it.
But right before we get into a little more in depth about Nightmare on Elm Street, I want to talk about 1984's The Hills Have Eyes Part 2, because this would be the first sequel that Craven would make, and this movie is just before I sort of had a radar on movies. I mean, just in that age range. So I'm not familiar with it. I did watch it about 3 weeks ago in preparation for this interview. I could barely get through the movie. And I'm just wondering, where do you stand on this as his first sequel? And obviously there's going to be more sequels to talk about, but this is his first sequel.
Yeah, well, it's, clearly not, I've, as much of an apologist as I am for often the sort of, the movies by directors I like that get a bad rap, that one does deserve its bad rap, and he would have been the first person to admit it. I mean, it was purely a movie that was done only for financial reasons, again, because he was kind of in financial trouble, and the opportunity came along where they were going to pay him to make it, and it was just kind of artistically, it was a misfire from the beginning. I mean, it has, they didn't even really shoot a whole movie. I haven't seen it in years, but if I remember correctly, they kind of incorporate a lot of footage from the original. And
exactly.
It's so, so they didn't even really, they didn't shoot as much new footage as you would ordinarily. It was really a purely opportunistic cash grab from everyone involved. And it didn't, the joke with that movie, I think, is, a good movie has a strong point of view. That movie so much has no point of view. I think there's actually a flashback in it from the point of view of a dog. I mean, it's really crazy. So, I think that one, it's been forgotten, and probably thankfully so.
So now that's going to bring us to the movie that inevitably changed his life. And this is a movie that I'm consider myself somewhat of an expert on. It's a movie that caused me a very traumatic childhood because I saw it at way too young of an age. That, of course, is the original Nightmare on Elm Street. He wrote the script. He was inspired by stories he read in newspapers about kids that were afraid to go to sleep, and, if they went to sleep, they would die. And when they finally did go to sleep, they did die. And he was just so inspired by those articles that he wrote the script, eventually passed it around. It was passed on many, many times, and eventually landed on the desk of Bob Shaye at New Line. And you had touched on it briefly about one of the worst decisions that Craven ever made. And I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, it's, I mean, there's two ways of looking at it. On the one hand, it's, on the one hand, it was the best decision he ever made because nobody was going to make that movie except for Bob Shaye. As you say, everyone in town passed on it. People didn't understand why it was scary on the page. Sean Cunningham read the script and said, well, if it's all a dream, this isn't scary. People didn't get how there was just something that wasn't connecting for people. And so Bob Shaye was really the only person who got it, but he also, because he was sort of the last stop, he was able to make this deal with Craven where Craven kind of gave away the rights to sequels and merchandising and all this stuff that at the time, I think Craven's attitude was, well, this thing is barely even going to get made, let alone are there going to be sequels or anything like that. And of course, the interesting thing about that movie, aside from, getting back to my point about him making iconic horror films in each decade, Nightmare on Elm Street is sort of doubly influential and interesting. On the one hand, it's very much of that era of the 80s, iconic killer era. Michael Myers, Jason, and then you've got Freddy Krueger and Nightmare on Elm Street, who I think is, of all those, the most interesting, and the sequels are certainly the most ambitious of any of those franchises. But then the other thing about Nightmare on Elm Street is you really could make a case that the entire landscape of American cinema was different because of that movie, not just because of how it influenced movies, but because it literally did create New Line as a company. I mean, before Nightmare on Elm Street, New Line Cinema, they had distributed a John Waters movie or two here and there, and some other, I think they had a hand in distributing Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but they weren't a major force. And Nightmare on Elm Street was such a huge hit, and because Craven had made such a bad deal, all the money went straight into New Line's coffers and basically made that company. So you could make the argument that if there had never been a Nightmare on Elm Street, there wouldn't be a Lord of the Rings.
Exactly.
There wouldn't be a Boogie Nights. We wouldn't have Paul Thomas Anderson as we know. There's so many, massive major films that in a way would never have come about had Nightmare on Elm Street never existed.
Well, take me through your first experience seeing Nightmare on Elm Street. This is 1984. Did you see it theatrically? Did you wait until it was out on VHS? Tell me about your first experience seeing that movie and your overall thoughts on that movie.
I did see it theatrically. I guess I must have been 12 years. Was it the summer of 84 that came out, or somewhere around there? So I would have been 12 years old, which was really when I was kind of at the height of my, being obsessed with horror movies. And yet, horror movies to me at that time almost always disappointed me. Like, I loved horror movies in theory, but in practice, especially slasher movies, especially the knockoffs of Halloween and Friday the 13th and all the Canadian tax shelter movies that were coming out, I went to see all of them, and I always wanted to be scared by them, and rarely was. And, Nightmare on Elm Street, I remember, was just like being hooked up to shock treatment or something after all that. Like, I literally felt my body vibrating as I was watching that movie because, again, it was a movie in that genre, but made by a guy who was a real artist and who really knew something about how to get under your skin. He did, going back to that idea that he was sort of influenced by these European filmmakers and everything, again, Nightmare on Elm Street, it's got this kind of surrealist quality that I think on the page is what made people not understand what was going to make it scary. But in the movie, in the theater, watching on the big screen, it really did have this just enveloping quality that something like My Bloody Valentine was never going to have, because he just could get into some sort of, I don't know, that movie just tapped into so many primal things, but it was also the way it did it, the way it was photographed. I mean, a lot of the films from that era, again, if you look at something like My Bloody Valentine or The Boogans or, whatever, those movies are shot like documentaries on strip mining. There's no artistry whatsoever to the photography in those movies. And, Nightmare on Elm Street, he had a cinematographer, Jacques Aitken, who was a real artist and really knew what to do with light and shadow and color and depth. And and he sort of does something interesting in that movie, which is that the edges of the frame are often very dark. It's kind of like the movie, it's sort of like the screen has no edges. So if you see that movie in a theater, you don't really know where the movie begins and ends, and the sort of geography of the theater begins and ends. And it's almost like a 3D movie that's not really in 3D. And that was kind of and maybe I'm just remembering it that way from when I saw it as a kid, but it was, it was one of those genre films from 84 to 86. I feel like there were a few movies that really breathed a lot of much needed life into independent genre filmmaking. And I think that was one. I think the original Terminator was one. The original Terminator was another movie that I remember just sitting in a theater and just thinking, wow, this is how it's done. This is what you're supposed to get out of one of these kind of movies. And that was the way I felt the first time I saw Nightmare on Elm Street.
We had talked about how Wes Craven really didn't have any involvement in the sequels, and we'll get to Wes Craven's New Nightmare in just a little bit, but you saw the original Nightmare on Elm Street in the theater. I have to assume you saw a Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Freddy's Revenge, in the theater, and I'm wondering if you immediately saw the disconnect between the two films.
Yeah, definitely. It didn't have any of those things that I was talking about. I mean, it sort of felt, seeing Nightmare on Elm Street 2 in the theater, it was kind of like going from John Carpenter's Halloween to Halloween 2, which in both cases, I actually think Halloween 2 and Nightmare on Elm Street 2 they're not terrible. I mean, they're not bad movies, especially compared to a lot of the other early 80s horror movies and slasher movies, but they're cases where you're going from a movie of such vision and personality and intelligence to something that's just, a little more anonymous. And I know for Nightmare on Elm Street 2, I know has sort of built up a cult over the years, partly because of the sort of very, I would say gay subtext, but it's almost more like text. It's such a big part of that movie. And I know that among gay audiences, there's kind of a whole cult that loves Nightmare on Elm Street 2 because of that. And it is an interesting aspect of it, and there are definitely interesting things in it. But, the movie, part of the problem is right off the bat, they kind of broke their own rules with Freddy, with the whole pool party sequence. They kind of, the part of the thing that made the Craven movie work was that it was surrealistic and dreamlike, but it also kind of had these rules it set out that it stuck to. And that, to me, when you lose that, it just, I don't know, it just felt a little like a cheat, and Freddy didn't feel like the same, he didn't feel as threatening to me in the sequel as he did in the first, and really never, and all the sequels, I mean, that's been an often commented on issue with the sequels, is that they did turn Freddy into almost more of a nightclub comic, and I think people forget how genuinely terrifying he was in the first movie.
Oh, absolutely. The first one, to me, is still, on a personal note, is the scariest movie to me. Like, I feel exactly the same way about Part 2. I feel like Part 3 may have righted the ship a little bit, and I know Craven had submitted a screenplay for that, and I think they kind of just cherry-picked a few ideas from the screenplay. I know Frank Darabont rewrote the script, from what I understand.
Right.
And I'm not going to go through all 8 or 9 Elm Street films, but do you feel like Nightmare on Elm Street 3 sort of kind of brought it back to a different place, or what are your thoughts on Part 3?
Yeah, I think 3 is the best of the sequels up until New Nightmare. In 3, I don't know how much they kept from Craven's script. I know that Craven wrote a script with Bruce Wagner, who is an absolutely brilliant writer. I mean, he's written 3 or 4 of the best novels about Hollywood, ever written, and he wrote the screenplay for Cronenberg's Maps to the Stars, which I think is a really great movie. And I don't know how, I've never read the Wagner Craven draft to know how much made its way into there, so I don't know if it's that they had influence, or if somebody at New Line just got a little bit of sense after the second one and realized they had to bring it back a little bit. But definitely, 3 is by far my favorite of the sequels. And in fact, there's even a little nod to Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, in my very un-Craven-like movie that I directed, Trouble with the Truth. There's the guy who plays the host at the restaurant. He has like one line when John Shea and Leah Thompson walk in the restaurant. He actually was one of the kids from the asylum in Nightmare on Elm Street 3. So it's kind of my little tip of the hat to Craven to throw him in there.
He was the wizard master.
Right.
I remember after seeing your film, I immediately emailed you and said, "Hey, now wait a second. Now you realize that guy was in Nightmare on Elm Street 3, right?" So, right. I said, "Was that on purpose?" So, we'll agree. Nightmare on Elm Street, genre defining, changed the landscape of horror films. So he really follows up Nightmare on Elm Street with 1986's Deadly Friend. Again, this is a movie that I did not watch until about a month ago. And, I always like to put myself in the time period when the movie came out. It's an interesting film, dealing with artificial intelligence. It almost doesn't even feel like it's going to be a horror movie or a slasher film or anything like that. I don't even know if he set out to, it was the original intention of that. Talk a little bit about Deadly Friend, if you will.
Right. Well, it's actually a very astute observation because it was not intended as a straight horror film initially. The screenplay was by Bruce Joel Rubin, who would go on later to do Jacob's Ladder and Ghost and My Life, and clearly a guy who was interested in ideas about life after death and all that kind of stuff. And his original script for Deadly Friend was considerably more both romantic and philosophical. And that's what attracted Craven to it, was that actually he thought he was going to do something a little different after Nightmare on Elm Street. He kind of felt like, okay, I've had my hit and now I'm going to do something that's, I've earned the right to make a slightly different kind of movie. And the original script for Deadly Friend wasn't even called Deadly Friend. It was just called Friend. And that was what, the whole intention, Wes Craven and Bruce Joel Rubin's part, was to do, a sort of more of a dark romance or something. And then what happened is along the line, and I don't know exactly where in the process what this happened, but basically I do know that Craven, his first cut of the film was test screened. And basically, these test screenings, it's like they go to a mall and get a bunch of kids to come and watch the movie. And they were telling movie people, come and watch Wes Craven's new movie, the director of Nightmare on Elm Street. So this recruited audience came into the screening expecting a horror movie, and they didn't get it. And needless to say, they gave it terrible ratings on the cards. And so the studio panicked a little bit and said, okay, we're going to rename it Deadly Friend, and we're going to reshoot a bunch of stuff. And they basically, I don't know the exact numbers, but somewhere around 25% to 30% of what ended up in the final movie was all reshoots, including things like the scene. I'm assuming people listening to this probably are familiar with at least this scene from the movie, but there's a scene where a woman's head is obliterated by a basketball.
Right.
That was not in the original movie. And there were a couple other moments like that. Basically, the moments of kind of graphic violence and a lot of the stuff that happens in the last 30 minutes or so was all added. And it was somewhat against, Craven, I think he shot the stuff, but his heart really wasn't in it. I mean, he really, I think, was very disappointed with where that movie went. And I think as is often the case with these sorts of things, it was really kind of a shame because the movie didn't end up being a big hit anyway, so it ended up being neither fish nor fowl. They didn't get the teenage horror crowd that they thought they were going to get by adding that stuff, and they kind of compromised what the movie was to begin with. And you really can't, it's hard to do that with a movie. I mean, I feel like a movie has its own, for lack of a better word, integrity, and it's sort of like when they would do this thing in the early 80s with Heaven's Gate and Once Upon a Time in America. Both of those movies, they released them and they didn't, and they're both around 4 hours, and they were bombing. So they pulled the movies from release and recut them into, chopped an hour out of it. And, making something shorter it's not going to make people like it more. And all it does is hurt what it originally was. And that was kind of what happened with Deadly Friend. Although I'm still fond of that movie. I still think there's a lot of really good stuff in it. And I do enjoy revisiting it.
Clearly the scenes that were added, they felt out of place with the tone of the movie. So,
yeah.
but I left that movie going, that was an interesting exercise in film watching right there. I found it really interesting. A lot of people will say, and I've heard this argument, that The Serpent and the Rainbow could be Wes Craven's best work ever. I'm wondering where you stand on that position.
I mean, I wouldn't argue with it. I mean, I think for me, you know, look, he's got several that I think you could make that claim for, and it kind of depends on the criteria you're using, because I think if your criteria is just, you know, brute blunt force, I think Last House on the Left is the best. I think if it's sheer, you know, originality and influence, Nightmare on Elm Street might be the best. Serpent and the Rainbow, certainly, I think, although, you know, Serpent and the Rainbow is in some ways his most successful blend, I think, of his more intellectual adult sensibility with the horror genre. I mean, it's a really interesting adult horror movie, and I think, you know, I think it is, again, he's, you know, as you said, he, you know, was a philosopher, basically, and it's one of his movies that gets most into metaphysical and philosophical issues while also being absolutely terrifying. I mean, I think the ideas in that movie are so scary. And, you know, I think it was really one of the first times when he had, you know, actors, not to denigrate the performances in his other movies, which are often very good, but it was sort of a different class of actors he had in Serpent and the Rainbow, having, you know, Bill Pullman and people like that, you know, sort of having that studio level pool of actors to work from. So I think in that sense, you know, it was kind of a big movie for him, and you know, yeah, it's certainly one of his best.
The next movie that he made, I don't know, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, if this was an attempt to start a new horror franchise with a new iconic horror villain. I'm of course talking about 1989 Shocker, starring Peter Berg, with the guy's name was Horace Pinkard, I think that was his name. That was the first Wes Craven movie I saw in the theater. I think I was 11 years old when I saw that movie, and at that age, I found the villain just terrifying. Now, going back, the fact that the movie wasn't successful probably derailed any chances of there being a sequel. But do you happen to know the story surrounding that movie?
Yeah, I do know that was the intention. I mean, that was part of the idea. Was, again, you know, Craven was bitter for a long time about the fact that he kind of, you know, gave away the store on Nightmare on Elm Street. And I think with Shocker, there was this idea of like, okay, I'm going to do it. I've done it once. I can do it again. I'm going to create a new iconic killer that we can carry on from movie to movie to movie. But this one I'm going to be in control of. And the problem was that at around the same time, in that same year that Shocker came out, there was another movie called The Horror Show with Lance Henriksen, which was basically the same premise. And I think the two movies kind of canceled each other out. It was like they sort of diluted each other's appeal in some way. And Shocker didn't really take off. And I mean, now I think Shocker is kind of, you know, it's kind of most interesting as a forerunner, as sort of a rough draft for some of the things he would get into later in movies like Scream and Wes Craven's New Nightmare, in terms of, you know, it's sort of the beginning of him becoming interested in the media. There's this whole kind of thing in Shocker where the killer like becomes, you know, parts of TV sets and broadcasts and things like that. And it's sort of the beginning of Craven's like playful, satirical side, making these movies that are kind of meta commentaries on the media and on violence in the media and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, it didn't really take with audiences in Shocker, but I think it became, you know, a very, very big, needless to say, a few years later in the movies that really brought him back. You know,
when I rewatched it, I have to tell you, I hadn't seen it, you know, almost 20 years. I found myself profoundly interested in what was going on in the movie. Like I found that I was kind of drawn to what was happening on screen, even though I had already seen the movie and I kind of had snippets in my head. But he played around with dream sequences and things that he was obviously familiar with. I mean, do you like the movie?
Yeah, I'm actually a big fan of Shocker. I think it's very underrated.
Let's talk about 1991's The People Under the Stairs.
Yeah.
This is the one Wes Craven film that I haven't seen. And I'm sorry, I was trying to get the ones that I hadn't seen in time for this podcast, but I just couldn't get it into my schedule. So I'm going to defer to you as to two questions, your thoughts on the movie, and two, this was also not a very successful release, correct?
You know, I'm not 100% sure on that. I mean, I think it was, you know, it certainly didn't set the world on fire, but it also, I don't know if it was considered a failure in the sense that I know it didn't cost a whole lot. He made it fairly cheap. And I don't know, I honestly am not an authority on whether or not it was commercially successful.
Okay.
I will say I think it is one of his best movies,
Okay.
and I think it's, it's in terms of talking about him as a political filmmaker and a satirist, People Under the Stairs is his most overtly political movie in that sense. It's all about a working class black neighborhood where there's a house where the evil people who live in it are these, it's this white couple played by Everett McGill and, the name of the female lead is escaping me, but both of them are from Twin Peaks. They both would be together on Twin Peaks not long after, they did People Under the Stairs together. Or maybe they're on Twin Peaks first. I don't know. My time frame on all that could be off. But anyway, but there's this whole sort of metaphorical thing, the whole movie is sort of about the haves and the have-nots and about kind of the decimation of the working class under Reaganomics, and Everett McGill is sort of intentionally made to resemble Ronald Reagan, and his wife calls him daddy, like Nancy Reagan called Ronald Reagan, and there's all kinds of, things like that. So it's kind of his most overtly and explicitly political movie, but it's also legitimately pretty scary and really funny. Ving Rhames is in it, and he's hilarious. I mean, certain aspects of it have dated a little bit. The costumes, it's one of those early 90s movies like Boomerang where everyone looks, is dressed like they're in a, Teletubbies episode or something. But I think it's a really, it's an interesting movie because it was one that he did, unlike Deadly Friend, he exerted total control over it. It was, he did it for Alive Films, the same place he did Shocker for. And at that time, Alive's whole business model was based on giving auteurs completely free reign as long as they kept their budgets low. Like basically, if they also did John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness and They Live, and the model was that if somebody like Carpenter or Craven came in and kept the budget under $5 million, they could do whatever the hell they wanted. So in all those cases, and They Live is one of Carpenter's most explicitly political movies. So it's sort of interesting in the cases of They Live and People Under the Stairs, you get you see what those directors do when no one is telling them what to do. And I think in both cases, they're pretty terrific movies.
So clearly, when I made the choice to watch The Hills Have Eyes Part 2.
Not one of your wiser decisions.
Yeah, so clearly. In late 1993, well, let's go back for a second. In 1991, New Line released Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, which was sort of their last gasp of the Nightmare franchise. I think sort of trying to, get whatever they could out of the franchise after a disastrous Part 5. They said that was going to be the last one. Late 1993, Bob Shea gets in contact with Wes Craven. I think from what I read, kind of signed over a few merchandising rights to him or paid him some past due royalties or something to that effect. Essentially as a way to kind of get him to come back to the series.
Right.
And gives him essentially carte blanche to make another Nightmare on Elm Street film. And from that we get Wes Craven's New Nightmare. And again, this is one I did see in the theater. I find it incredibly terrifying in some parts, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on Wes Craven's New Nightmare.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's a little bit hard maybe for people now who didn't see it when it came out in the theater to recognize how stunning that movie was when it came out, because in a way it's been so imitated ever since, including by Craven himself to a certain degree in the Scream movies. But I mean, New Nightmare, I feel like you're right. Aside from just the self-referential part of it, which was great, it was, I remember seeing it in the theater and thinking it was the first time in a long time that a movie had really, really scared me. And I feel like, even just, and again, I think he's so good at doing things that are fantastical, but also tapping into very basic, relatable fears. I mean, the scariest stuff in New Nightmare to me is the constant earthquakes that keep erupting through the whole movie. And living in Los Angeles and having been here when there was a big earthquake about 6 months before that movie came out, I mean, that just rattled me completely watching it in the theater. But, I think, it's easy to forget now when that film came out, it was really just at the beginning of the whole idea of movies being self-referential. I mean, it was just at the beginning of Tarantino starting to emerge as a big thing. And it was a few years before Scream. And that whole aspect of it where Wes Craven was making a Nightmare on Elm Street sequel that was about Nightmare on Elm Street and its sequels, and it was done really smartly. It wasn't done as just a gimmick. I think it's a really great movie, and I would have to agree with you. It's probably, for my money, one of his 3 or 4 best.
Excellent. How do you feel about Vampire in Brooklyn?
Vampire in Brooklyn, I have to admit, I haven't seen since it came out. I was not particularly wowed by it. I saw it first show, first day at the Man Chinese when it opened, and I was very excited for that movie, being both a big, at the time, Eddie Murphy fan and Wes Craven fan. And, I should see it again because I don't always trust my own memory about things like this. But I do recall when I saw it kind of thinking that it was a case of, rather than them both bringing something good to each other, I felt like they kind of canceled each other out. It was neither a particularly funny movie nor a particularly scary movie. So, in terms of my recollection, it was probably my least favorite Wes Craven movie aside from, Hills Have Eyes 2.
We're going to talk about 1996 for a moment. I'm going to put you where I was. I was 18 years old in 96. I had just moved out on my own. And the job I was working, all the buzz one day was about this movie, this new horror movie that came out that everybody needs to go see. And so I asked what it was. They said it's called Scream. For whatever reason, when I was 18 years old, I wasn't really into the horror movies anymore. I think they had run their course for me. But I went and saw the movie. I remember seeing it. I think it had even been out for a couple weeks. And when I saw that movie, Jim, I didn't even realize it was a Wes Craven film until obviously the movie started. And like the rest of the world, just loved it. I thought it was brilliant. I thought the script was brilliant. It was incredibly smart. And instead of just going, keep going year by year by year by year, let's talk about the entire Scream franchise and your thoughts on the original and the subsequent 3 sequels to follow.
Mm-hmm. Well, the original, I have to say, is probably my favorite Wes Craven movie. And I do think one of the reasons is, again, I always go back to those 80s slasher movies that I, again, as a kid, liked more in theory than in practice. And Scream really took those, movies like Prom Night and Terror Train and all those, and it just elevated them to a level of high art. I mean, it was really amazing. And that movie, when it came out, again, it's hard now, especially for people to remember how dead the horror genre was when Scream came out. I mean, it was history. I mean, I never really stopped loving horror movies, but there became a period where they just stopped releasing them. I mean, the early to mid 90s, studios were not releasing horror movies theatrically, and even the independent companies, there wasn't, this was pre-Blair Witch, it was pre-Blumhouse, it was pre all those things. And Scream was not, it wasn't necessarily a movie that everybody thought was a slam dunk when Craven made it, although it was a script that it was one of those kind of very hot scripts that a lot of people wanted to make. I mean, in fact, you wouldn't believe some of the people who were trying to get that job, who were trying to direct Scream. I mean, Oliver Stone was trying to buy the script for Scream at one point, which would have been, an interesting movie. And a lot of other people. But, ultimately the Weinsteins got their hands on the script. And it was not a movie that people had a huge amount of faith in while they were making it. I mean, nobody believed in the design of the killer. The mask that they had for the killer. Those dailies were coming back to the Weinsteins, and everybody in the company was just like, this is not scary. This is, which is hard to believe now, but they were looking at it and nobody got it. And then the movie, that was sort of the opposite of the Deadly Friend experience, where they did a test screening of the movie and it just tested through the roof. The audience, it was the best, test screening results in Miramax's history, or I guess Dimension Films. And literally after the first test screening, Harvey and Bob Weinstein took Wes Craven out to dinner and were like, we're not letting you leave here until you sign a deal to make Scream 2. And they said, we know you want to do a petticoat movie, meaning like one of the movies, the other kinds of movies they would make with like Gwyneth Paltrow, like Emma and things like that. And they were like, and they said to him, we'll let you do one of those if you do Scream 2. And that's how he ended up doing Music of the Heart. That was sort of a package deal for the Weinsteins, where they just kind of let him do Music of the Heart if he would do Scream 2. And, anyway, but so Scream, again, just in terms of how influential he was, that movie just single-handedly brought horror back and kind of, it's never gone away since then. But it's, horror in 1996, I'm not kidding you, it was as dead as the Western is considered by people now. I mean, and I know again, we had a couple this year with Hateful Eight and Revenant or whatever, but horror was like the Western, where like you might get one or two of them a year here and there, but it was essentially gone. And Craven brought it back. That movie was so good that it resurrected an entire genre.
One of the things about that Scream movie I want to just mention here is that it brought horror back without a hint of a supernatural element, and the violence in Scream is brutal. It is absolutely brutal. The scene with Drew Barrymore, I mean, it's terrifying and it's brutal, and there isn't a hint of supernatural anything in that film, in all four of them.
Right.
How do you feel about the sequels in general?
The sequels, I like all of them. I don't think, I actually am probably, of them, 4 is probably my favorite of the sequels, and I like them all. I don't think any of them have the just sheer perfection that the first one does. But I think, Scream 2, I think, has a few of the best set pieces Craven ever directed. I mean, the thing, in the car and even the opening scene, is terrific. And the scene in the radio station, like there are a few really great set pieces in Scream 2. Scream 3, I'm kind of a sucker for because I'm always a sucker for Hollywood on Hollywood movies. And Scream 4 I thought was actually really Scream 4 had only one flaw for me that it's hard to talk about without giving away something for people who haven't seen it. But basically, let's just leave it at, I thought the person who had turned out to be the killer or one of the killers, they sort of chose the person who had the least amount of, for me, acting heft to be able to pull it off, to pull off the reveal. And that was kind of a slightly weak spot about that for me. But in general, I like all the Scream sequels. I don't know that any of them, again, I just think the first one it's really a perfect movie. And I don't know that the sequels have what you're talking about in terms of the first one being really affecting in terms of the violence. Like when Drew Barrymore dies in the opening scene of Scream, I mean, it feels like someone dying. It doesn't feel like a joke, even though the movie is very funny. The violence in it doesn't feel like kidding around. And the climax of Scream with the two guys stabbing each other in the house, I mean, it's very, very brutal and effective and disturbing. And for me personally, the sequels don't have that level of, that dimension isn't there so much. They are more kind of just really fun, really well done horror comedies. And I like them all on that level, but they're not as good as the first one.
I will say, and this is spoiler alert to anybody who hasn't seen Scream 2. Spoiler alert. Jamie Kennedy's death in Scream 2 is pretty brutal. I'm going to give the nod to that one. That's a pretty brutal scene.
I'll give you that, yeah.
So, okay, so let's talk about Music of the Heart just for a moment, because this was, a complete 180 from anything that Craven's ever done before. I mean, we talked earlier about, a couple of these made-for-TV movies that he made. Where does he come up with Music of the Heart? I understand now you explained perfectly, his ability to get the movie done, but I'm just wondering where he drew the inspirations from.
Yeah, well, it was based on a documentary that he had seen, and I think Miramax may have even released the documentary, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So people should check it before trusting me on that one. But I do know that the teacher who Meryl Streep plays in that movie was based on a real person, and there was a documentary about her, and either Craven had seen that or the Weinsteins owned the rights to fictionalize the documentary or something. Somehow it just basically, when he sat down with them to figure out what was going to be his free movie that he was going to get to do in exchange for Scream 2, that subject, it appealed to him, having been a teacher and having somebody being somebody who's into the arts. And I think it was a movie that he felt a lot of personal investment in as someone who felt like, funding for the arts and for these inner city schools and things like that was going away. In a way, even though it wasn't overtly political, it kind of was another one of his political films. And, clearly it gave him this opportunity that, the opportunity to make a movie with Meryl Streep. I mean, I think off the top of my head, it's the only Wes Craven movie I know of that went up for Oscars, because Meryl Streep went up for it. And I think a song may have even gone up. But yeah, it came from that documentary that he had seen and responded to. And it's an indication, he could have, I think, had a more diverse career and been the kind of director who did a lot more different kinds of things. In a way, Last House on the Left, I think, was so ferocious that he was never going to get over that. I don't care, and of course Nightmare on Elm Street just solidified it, but, he used to talk about how Last House on the Left, when he did that movie, he was no longer welcome in polite company. I mean, the circles he would travel in as an academic, he would be at parties after he made Last House on the Left, and people would move to the other side of the room. Like, they just were so put off by him. And I think that even in the industry, in the film industry, those early movies, he never shook the impression of how savage those were. So that even after he made a movie with Meryl Streep as a high school music teacher, I still I don't know. People never, could really see him any other way. And so, it doesn't, at the end of the day, look, it doesn't matter because he made so many great movies, and who cares if they were all in one particular genre, but I do think directors' careers, I think there are a lot of directors who, if the wind blew just one way or another, I think a lot of directors are capable of a lot more than you get to see. And I think there are also directors who luck out and get to do a lot of different kinds of movies who, if one thing had gone kind of differently, they'd be in a different position.
Red Eye, I think is a fun movie. Again, it's suspenseful, and it really goes into an ending I didn't really see coming, but, I really enjoyed that film. So just briefly, you enjoyed Red Eye?
Yeah, I think Red Eye is terrific. And I think Red Eye, the first, I would have, even though I did like the kind of unexpected direction the ending went in, it almost would have been interesting. I was a little disappointed when they got off the plane, I have to admit. Like, I really wanted to see if he could sustain that tension of them being in one spot for the full 90 minutes, because I feel like the first, however long, the first 45 minutes or an hour, however long they're actually on that plane, is really a clinic in how to direct a movie like that. I mean, it's just brilliant the way that he kind of just keeps the tension escalating in that small space. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that movie.
Let's talk about 2010's My Soul to Take. And the reason I want to mention this, because it was the second to last film that he directed. I mean, Scream 4 came out technically after it. And this movie was a critical and financial failure. And I'm trying to pinpoint why, because I've seen the movie and I think it's fine. And I agree. I don't understand where did this movie fall victim to in 2010 when My Soul to Take came out. We were right at the beginning stages of everyone's a critic. Everybody has a Twitter account. The Metascores are now compounded by not just 5 reviewers, but 500 reviewers. And I'm wondering if this was one of the early casualties of everybody's a critic and bad word of mouth. People were bad-mouthing the film without even seeing it.
Yeah, I think there's 2 factors, and that's one of them for sure. I think the other factor is that movie it also came at the beginning of a period when everybody was going bonkers for 3D stuff. Yeah. Like, the studios were all wanting to release things in 3D. And My Soul to Take was not shot in 3D, but the distributor released it in 3D. They post-converted it because it was, this was in the post-Avatar days when everybody was like, hey, we can make a lot more money if we put it in 3D and jack up these ticket prices. And I think My Soul to Take suffered a little bit from that because it should never have been released in 3D. And by doing that, everybody immediately sniffed out that it was a cash grab. And that wasn't Craven's fault. And it had nothing to do really with the quality of the movie. But I think it made people gun for it a little bit. And the fact that combined with the fact that now they all had this voice on the internet that was really sort of exploding at that point, it was sort of a perfect storm to make that movie, much less appreciated than it should have been. And I'm not saying it's one of his best movies, but like you say, it certainly didn't deserve the scorn that was heaped on it.
And to be fair, in the interest of full disclosure, I didn't see it in the theater. I did see a video on demand release, which was 2D, so I didn't see the 3D version of the film. So yeah. I wasn't impacted by a post-converted 3D film, but I liked it. I mean, I enjoyed it, and part of that, maybe part of that was the fact that I like Wes Craven. And so I'm going to give everything that he does an above average fair shake,
Right. So. No, absolutely. I'm even a fan of, an even more maligned movie of his in a way, Cursed. I don't think is the horrible movie that a lot of people think it is.
You can add that one to the list of Craven films I haven't seen. There's 2 movies I'm going to be watching tomorrow. I'm going to be watching The People Under the Stairs and Cursed tomorrow.
Well,
so.
Here's the interesting thing about Cursed. Cursed is very compromised and that movie, I don't know how much you know about the production history of Cursed, but it is just insane. That movie, I remember reading a draft of that script that they ended up just, basically they shot it and then scrapped it. They shot a whole version of Cursed that had a lot of, several different actors, including Skeet Ulrich. Scott Baio is in both versions of Cursed playing himself, but in the first version of Cursed, he was the werewolf. It turned out that Scott Baio, as himself, was the werewolf and was running this, army of werewolves around Los Angeles. And there was all this stuff. The original draft of the script, which I thought was great, they shot it, and I don't know exactly what happened, but again, somewhere somebody at the Weinstein Company didn't like what was coming back. And they essentially scrapped the movie that had been, they didn't like the design of the werewolves and all that. And so they scrapped the first cut of the movie and reshot almost all of it. It was sort of like what happened with Woody Allen's movie, September, which he reshot with a different cast. They basically recast Cursed, shot it again. And then at the last minute, they panicked at the Weinstein Company and decided that they didn't want to release it as an R movie. They wanted it to be PG-13. And at that point, Craven just walked off the movie and quit because it hadn't been conceptualized as a PG-13 movie. And his whole argument was, look, I know how to do a PG-13 movie, but if you start with thinking it's an R, you can't just cut the stuff out and have it still work, which is essentially what they did. The version of the movie that came out was PG-13, and it does feel compromised, but it's also certainly not anywhere near as bad as people say, and there's a lot of fun stuff. But I always kind of wish somewhere that footage would surface. I wish they'd put out a DVD that would have the footage they shot originally from the first draft of the script before they changed everything, because it had so much great stuff. There was a crazy opening sequence at a Hollywood Halloween party where a guy, they think he's dressed as a werewolf, but he actually is a werewolf and then eats someone. And that wasn't in the movie. There's a lot of really fun stuff like that ended up not being in the final movie. And I don't know if they saved the footage anywhere, and I keep hoping somewhere along the line it'll pop up, but I don't know.
All right. Well, you got me excited to see this one. I'm going to be watching that one first. The 25th anniversary of A Nightmare on Elm Street, you interviewed Wes Craven.
Right.
Tell me about that conversation. How long did you guys chat for that particular interview? For those listening, I'll be providing a link in the show notes that will bring you to that interview that you can read it. So talk about that interview.
Yeah, we talked for about 45 minutes, and as I said, I knew Craven, casually since, somewhere probably around 2005. I used to write for a now defunct website called darkworlds.com. It was a horror site, and I had written pieces on several of his movies in conjunction with their DVD releases. When they put out People Under the Stairs and Serpent in the Rainbow and Shocker and Hills Have Eyes, all of those in the mid 2000s came out on DVD, and I had written pieces on them, and I sent them to I emailed Craven. I found Craven's email was listed in the DGA's member guide or whatever, and so I just sent him an email and said, hey, I'm a filmmaker and a writer, and I'm a huge fan of yours, and I thought you might enjoy these pieces. And so I sent him links to the articles, and he wrote me back, and he enjoyed them, and we kind of stayed in touch, and every once in a while he would invite me to a screening of one of his movies, like I saw Cursed before it came out and a couple others. And so we sort of stayed in touch and were friendly over the years. And then about not too long before the 25th anniversary of Nightmare on Elm Street, I was...
I'm sorry to interrupt you just for a second. We're saying 25th. It was the 30th, right? It was the 30th.
Oh, you're probably, gosh.
And I'm just going to correct that. I'm so sorry. It was the 30th anniversary. Because
you're right.
I was like, wait a second. The 30th anniversry was last year, or was 2 years ago. Why am I saying 25 years? So everyone who's listening, I'm sorry. I meant the 30th anniversary. So.
Right. Well, I forgot. I forgot too. But so yeah. So somewhere around, I guess it would have been in the fall of 2014, I started doing a little bit of writing for Filmmaker Magazine's website, and they were interested in having me interview directors. And so since I had this connection with Craven, I emailed him and asked him, would you be willing to do an interview on Elm Street? And he said yes. And so we talked about the movie for about 45 minutes, and it was great. I mean, he was one of those directors who, is everything in person that you hope he'll be. I mean, I think sometimes, that you can be a little bit scared to meet one of your heroes, because it's very crushing if you meet someone who you revere and they turn out to be a jerk or something. And Craven was the exact opposite of that. I mean, he was just a very articulate and sweet man. And, needless to say, I was very, very glad I'd had that conversation with him, a year later when he passed away, because it didn't even occur to me to think we'd ever, I mean, I know this sounds crazy, but I just never thought there would be a world where we wouldn't have him.
2 questions real quick. First of all, first one is, when you interviewed him about Elm Street, was there anything new you learned or anything new you took away from Nightmare on Elm Street after talking to him about it?
I think the one thing I took away, and I'm not sure if this even came through in the printed, edited version of the interview, or if this is just what I took away from it, reading between the lines, talking to him. But, something I took away from that interview is how delicate movies are, and how just a movie that becomes a classic like that it is just everything coming together in the right place at the right time. And any one decision, could change it all. I mean, just, it really, because honestly, the whole thing with, Robert Shea taking the chance on it, probably at the time Craven was very discouraged by the fact that everyone else in town passed and all that. But clearly Robert Shea and New Line were the right company to make that movie. Maybe somebody like Paramount wouldn't have known what to do with it if he had gotten some place like that, and it wouldn't have gotten, released, and I don't know. It's just interesting to me how that kind of thing, how much of it just kind of depends on luck and chance, and how, him making it, when he was making that movie, he didn't know he was making anything iconic or classic. I mean, he was just a director trying to make his days while, blood was gushing everywhere and they weren't able to clean it up fast enough and things like that. So yeah, I don't know. It was, it was interesting. And certainly it just was interesting to talk to him and see how, he still seemed kind of shocked that Freddy Krueger was something that had entered the consciousness. Like, he still just seemed bewildered by that a little bit.
And the final question I have for you was, he passed away from, if I read correctly, brain cancer, correct?
Yeah.
And did he keep that to himself, or was there just a very small inner circle that knew about that? Was that common knowledge? Because his death, I remember emailing you the day that it happened. You were the first person I reached out to. I literally said, hey, we need to do something about this, because I had no indication. Was it something that was readily known and I just had missed the, any article about that?
No, I think he kept it pretty close to the vest. I think it was basically him and his family and his really close friends. I don't think it was, my impression among other filmmakers and among people in the horror community is everyone was completely shocked, the day it happened. And, I had actually emailed him a couple months beforehand about doing another interview, because People Under the Stairs came out on Blu-ray, around just before he died. Scream Factory put out a new Blu-ray of it, and I had emailed him to see if he was interested in doing an interview on that, and got a nice response back, but just basically saying, it's not really a good time, and, but I hope all is well. And, he probably was already, getting close to the end at that point, but he wasn't making it very public. I think it was a big shock to most people outside of his inner circle.
Well, that was, I'll agree. As somebody who was a lifelong fan of his work, and clearly you were as well, I think we both shared the same feelings the day that came out. And I know that, the internet and Twitter and my Twitter feed and people had, I must have gotten somewhere in the neighborhood of about 10 or 15 emails, people emailing me saying, Dana, when are you going to do Wes Craven? You got to do Wes Craven now. You got to talk about it. You got to do it. And I didn't want to rush it. I wanted to just, wait a little bit. And I think now was the perfect time. And so, Jim, there wasn't anybody else in the world that I would have wanted to do this episode with than you, because you just brought so much to the table, and your experiences, not only knowing him in person, but, being a fan of his work throughout his entire career. So I really want to take this time and thank you for being on the show and being a part of this retrospective. Well,
I appreciate the opportunity. I mean, anytime I can spread the gospel of Wes Craven, I'm happy to. I think he's still, as popular as he is and as iconic as a few of those movies are, I think in a strange way, he's still a slightly underrated director.
No, and I would agree with you. If people want to follow your work and they want to follow you on Twitter, where can people go?
The best place to I have a blog, which is jimhemphillfilms.com, or on Twitter, it's at Jimmy Hemphill. And those are the two best ways, I guess, to keep track of me.
All right. Excellent. Well, Jim, thank you again. And I look forward to having you back on the show real soon. Thank you.
Thank you.